In part three, we considered the roles that people play in a just society. In part four, we're going to continue to explore that, looking at Plato's book 4, The Republic, and we'll explore certain challenges that might be raised against his view and how Plato responds to those. So in book 4, one of the things that he does is raise this issue of the happiness of the guardians. The guardian class are not people who are able to have property rights. They don't have an opportunity to become wealthy. And so it seems like they may not be as happy as those others who do have property rights and opportunities to become wealthy. And so that might seem problematic, like those people wouldn't be satisfied in their role. And part of the response to this is Plato goes on to talk about the dangers of wealth on both sides of having too much or having too little. So for example, he explains that if a craftsman has too much wealth, they're going to become lazy. They're going to become careless in their craft. They don't need to be excellent in order to eat well, etc. But that's true of anyone, right? So too much wealth is going to be problematic. Too little wealth means that somebody doesn't have the resources, the proper tools to perform their role well. And so you have to have that moderated, and the guardians can have that moderated by the state so that they're taken care of. They're provided with a place to live, not extravagant, but moderate. They're provided with food, not luxurious food, but what they need to survive. Now, a potential harmful effects of musics and games for children is considered here. And the idea, the concern is that lawlessness might creep in, to use Plato's words, through these things. So we have to monitor these. And Plato talks about how it's always desirable to have new music, but he said that's not necessarily a good thing. We want to have control over these things. In fact, he even talks about having control over people's hair, what style they have, what clothes they wear, what shoes they have. And we need to keep things standardized so that people have a respect for law. That's the goal with music and games for children especially. And it's noted, though, that in an unjust state, you cannot just come into a state and enact laws and make them become just people. So laws do not prevent injustice. In such a situation, right, people are going to consider authorities harsh when they're merely speaking the truth. And so Plato acknowledges that his prescription here can't just be forced onto a society or a culture. It's not going to work. People are going to rebel against that. So we have the qualities of an ideal state described here in book 4. The state as a whole has a virtue of wisdom when the people who are in charge are focusing on the eternal and the beautiful. And so you need to have that ruling class who are philosophers who are contemplating the forms. You need to have courage displayed in the culture. And part of that is going to be having a right belief about what is to be feared and what's not to be feared. And so we saw that death should not be something that's feared because we don't even know what happens. And temperance or moderation, or sometimes if it's in relation to drink, sobriety. This is all people in all classes need to maintain these virtues. And when done so, then there is harmony among the parts. So when there is temperance among the craftsmen, they are not desiring to seek that excess wealth. And so they don't have the problem that we just mentioned. And overall, what you need then is submission of those in the lower positions to those who have higher authorities. So the craftsmen submit to the soldiers and guardians. They follow the laws, and the soldiers and guardians do as the rulers direct. And when everybody's playing their role properly and submitting to authorities, things are going to work well, and you're going to have a just state. So we have an idea of justice when it comes to a state. It's everyone doing their own business, performing their own function well, at doing what produces a harmonic state, doing what preserves a state of harmony in the society. So likewise, then, we can take these ideas of our justice written large in a city and start to think about how those are going to apply to an individual person when we consider parts of a soul. So these are going to be analogous to the classes that were described in the city-state. And there is an appetitive part of the soul. Now, some appetites are necessary, so it is important to have an appetite for food, for water, for example, to have thirst. Those things are necessary, but others are unnecessary. Now, primarily we're talking about indulgences, too much alcohol, for example, too much of good food. So it's okay to desire food, but luxurious food, fancy desserts maybe would be ruled out. You shouldn't have these indulgences. And the same is true with sex, that there might be an appropriate amount of desire, but to have excess and to do a bunch of exploration and desire other partners that are not yours would be excessive. And those are unnecessary appetites for Plato. There is a thumos, a spirited part of the soul, and this is going to correspond to that soldier guardian class that needs to align with reason. This is the part that wants to fight, that gets angry. And then, of course, there is reason, that which pursues virtue, and reason, of course, is that which ought to rule the individual. It should be in charge. And you have this argument of different parts of the soul, that there are, in fact, these three aspects of the soul, and it's based on the potential for conflict within one's soul. So you may even your reason may tell you that you shouldn't be angry at something that you are. And so we have that distinction. Obviously, reason and anger are in different parts of the soul. And again, reason might tell you that you've eaten too much, or you shouldn't want to eat more when your stomach is already full, but you see that wonderful piece of chocolate cake or something like that that still is stirring your appetites. Reason can conflict with that and tell you not to eat, can guide you in those things. So as the parts of our soul may conflict with one another, it's pretty obvious that we do have parts of our soul, according to Plato. So now we can talk about virtues when it comes to an individual person in the soul. So as an initial point here, we have virtues that are going to correspond to the parts of the soul. So wisdom is the virtue of reason commanding the other parts. It's related to the reasonable part of the soul, and it's directing things. And when that's occurring, a person has wisdom. Courage is going to be steadfast obedience to reason when one is defending their mind or their body. So courage has to do with keeping things in check, not too much anger, but enough to fight to defend oneself to make sure that one remains healthy, so, for example. And then temperance is going to be that lower part, the appetitive part, being submitted to the enforcement of emotions from the spirited part, and being submitted, of course, to wisdom, to the reasoned part of the soul, to eat and drink what is appropriate and not in excess. So justice then is kind of a comprehensive virtue when all of the parts of the soul are acting properly, and one has wisdom and courage and temperance. justice is there. So justice is the right ordering of the soul in accord with the other three virtues that are mentioned. So obviously you cannot have a just person without these other virtues. And in fact, justice, the virtues together imply that one is just. And if one is just, that means one has all of the virtues. So all the virtues reciprocally imply each other. There is a unity of the virtues. And this is a topic that's taken up in medieval philosophy, and people argue about it, whether it's possible to be courageous without having temperance, for example. Plato gives the groundwork for saying the answer to that question is no, that's not possible. You have to have all of them to have any of them. So the key then, of course, is wisdom ruling over the other parts. When that is occurring, when one has wisdom, contemplating the forms, has a good understanding of reality, and wisdom is guiding, putting boundaries on one's spirit, putting rules in effect for one's appetites, then you have all of those virtues. And if that's not occurring, then one doesn't really have wisdom. And so you have this appeal to function. So when one part's not functioning properly, the others can't function properly. If the appetitive part of the soul is always striving after more and more, well, that means that the reason is not functioning properly there. And so we have virtue and justice being a state of well-being within a person. It's the only way a person can be truly happy. They're comfortable with themselves, and reason is in charge. So well-being then is something that's desired for its own sake. And justice is a state of well-being. And so we have justice being sought for its own sake. And obviously, we've already said that it's clearly sought for its consequences. So at this point in Book 4, Plato has answered the concerns of Glaucon that it is not sought for its own sake. Once we understand the nature of justice, we see why it is sought for its own sake. Now, in part 5, we're going to go on and look at Plato's guidelines for families and relationships and social structures of the just state. And we have some kind of odd things to say when we look at those relationships.